For decades, riders were told Chinese motorcycles were cheap for a reason. Cheap labor, cheap parts, cheap shortcuts. But that explanation doesn't work anymore. And it hasn't for a while. Because Chinese motorcycles didn't just get better. They tapped into something motorcycles never had before. Automotive scale money, factories, and learning speed. That one shift explains why the quality jumped, why features showed up early, and why the prices stopped behaving normally. Stick with me to the end, because once you understand this automotive secret, the market stops looking random, and a lot of old assumptions quietly fall apart. The price that didn't behave normally. At first, it shows up as a pause, a longer look across a showroom floor. A price tag that feels slightly out of place, not shocking, just off enough to slow you down. Nothing about the bike screams bargain. Yet the number under it refuses to behave the way memory says it should. For years, the explanation was easy: cheap labor, loose standards, government help. Those answers once filled the gap between what riders expected and what they saw. They worked because the bikes matched the story. Sparse features, rough finishes, clear compromises that explained the savings without argument. What breaks the pattern now is that the story no longer fits the object. The finish looks deliberate, the layout looks considered, the equipment list reads like something from a higher shelf. The usual shortcuts are hard to find, yet the price still sits where it always did. That mismatch creates discomfort because experience says corners must exist somewhere. The unease comes from realizing old math is failing. If labor alone explained everything, the gap would have narrowed by now. If standards were still loose, the evidence would show up immediately. Instead, the numbers remain stubborn while the bikes move forward. When expectations and reality stop lining up, it suggests the force at work is not the one. Everyone keeps naming. If the price is not the story anymore, else pushes it. The power sitting behind the badge. Looking for answers inside the motorcycle world misses the point. The forces reshaping these brands sit elsewhere, in places measured by factories, ports, and balance sheets rather than brochures. Once attention shifts outward, the picture changes from isolated companies to parts of machines. These brands are not operating alone. They sit within industrial groups that build far more than motorcycles, sharing logistics, engineering talent, and production discipline across multiple divisions. Where a traditional motorcycle maker might rely on a handful of suppliers, these groups coordinate entire ecosystems, moving ideas and resources without the friction outsiders face. The contrast matters because scale changes what is possible. Small manufacturers plan around scarcity, protecting limited tooling and cautious timelines. Vertically integrated groups plan around abundance, assuming capacity, and adjusting direction quickly. That difference shows up in consistency and speed, not in promises or slogans. It is important to avoid reading intention into this backing. The presence of large industrial support does not automatically imply a strategy aimed at domination. It simply establishes that the resources exist to try, to fail, and to refine without threatening survival. That safety net alters behavior in subtle ways. Understanding who stands behind these brands explains how capacity appears so quickly. But it does not explain whether that capacity is used well. Resources can build many things, but they cannot guarantee competence. That unanswered question hangs over what follows. If this breakdown is changing how you see the market, support the channel by liking the video, subscribing for deep dives, and sharing your perspective in the comments. Why features started showing up early. The timing of new equipment matters more than the sticker attached to it. Certain features began appearing on entry and middle segments earlier than anyone expected, not as highlights, but as defaults. That shift raised eyebrows because it disrupted the usual rollout pattern riders had learned to anticipate. Historically, new components arrived in stages. First at the top, then slowly filtering downward as costs fell and production stabilized. What changed was the disappearance of that waiting period. Items that once took years to reach broader availability seemed to arrive almost immediately. skipping the familiar progression. This was not about superiority or performance claims. It was about presence. Screens, sensors, and interfaces became common simply because they were there, ready to be used. Their appearance felt less like a decision and more like an inevitability, as if the supply had been waiting for an outlet. The language around these features matters. Describing them as premium misses the point. They did not arrive because someone decided to impress buyers. They arrived because the surrounding industrial environment made them ordinary. When something becomes ordinary, it stops signaling status and starts signaling infrastructure. Seeing features show up early explains how these motorcycles look current so quickly, but it does not explain whether that appearance should be trusted. Availability answers the question of when, not the question of why. That distinction becomes important sooner than expected. For transparency, the riding gear and accessories used during these evaluations are listed in the description. Back to the breakdown. The day the cheap metal line stopped working, the argument about weak materials lingered longer than it deserved. It became a shortcut explanation, repeated without inspection, standing in for deeper questions about process. For a time, it matched what people saw. Then, it quietly stopped matching reality. What changed was not philosophy, but capability. Manufacturing shifted from small batch methods to controlled systems borrowed from larger industries. Casting, welding, and finishing moved under tighter supervision, guided by repeatable procedures rather than individual judgment. That shift reduced variation, which had always been the real enemy. Inside the factory, the difference is visible in how work flows. Components move through standardized stages, monitored and adjusted with consistency. Automation appears not as a replacement for skill, but as a way to preserve it, locking results in place once they are achieved. This does not mean every product is perfect. It means the old blanket criticism no longer applies. Dismissing everything as cheap metal ignores the reality of how modern manufacturing operates when scale and discipline intersect. Recognizing this change is uncomfortable because it removes an easy explanation. If the materials are no longer the weak link, attention has to move elsewhere. Capability now exists in places it once did not, raising a harder question about where the remaining differences truly come from. That question points directly toward learning, transfer, and the paths knowledge follows, even when nobody intended it to move. That way, why outsourcing seemed like a safe bet. Outsourcing once felt like common sense, not surrender. Costs were rising in familiar places, margins narrowing, schedules tightening. Established manufacturers faced pressure to keep prices stable while regulations multiplied and model ranges expanded. Moving certain tasks elsewhere looked like maintenance, not transformation. The decision was framed around logistics. Parts could be produced closer to suppliers. Assembly could happen where capacity already existed. Shipping lanes were established, labor pools trained, facilities modern. None of this sounded radical. It sounded efficient, the kind of adjustment companies had made for decades without losing identity. Crucially, the work being moved was defined as execution, not thinking. Blueprints stayed home. Specifications were written elsewhere. Oversight remained centralized. In that environment, it was easy to believe knowledge would remain contained, flowing in one direction only. What made the environment different was density. Factories were no longer isolated contractors, but nodes inside larger industrial networks. Engineers rotated between projects. Processes overlapped. Standards were shared to keep schedules aligned. Learning became a side effect of simply keeping things running smoothly. No one set out to give anything away. The goal was to protect heritage while managing cost and scale. Outsourcing promised relief without risk, a way to buy time. What went unnoticed was that time cuts both ways. Skills accumulate quietly. Familiarity grows. And once familiarity exists, exchange stops being one-sided. Costs fell, but knowledge moved alongside quietly. skills that spread without a contract. Learning did not arrive labeled or negotiated. It seeped in through routine, carried by repetition rather than instruction. When work is done to specification every day, understanding grows without formal exchange. The knowledge that transferred was procedural. How to measure consistently, how to document variation, how to correct small deviations before they spread. These habits do not belong to any one product. They belong to process, and process travels easily when people share space and schedules. Standards played a quiet role. Meeting external requirements demanded discipline in calibration, inspection, and reporting. Once those systems were in place, they became reusable frameworks rather than single-use tools. Each cycle reinforced the last, tightening expectations without ceremony. Tolerances became a language everyone spoke, not in meetings but on the floor. When limits are enforced daily, they stop feeling foreign. They become instinctive. That instinct is difficult to separate from the hands that develop it. None of this required intent. No strategy memo needed signing. Learning occurred because production demands consistency, and consistency rewards attention. Over time, attention becomes mastery. Mastery rarely remains dependent. Eventually, capability asks for room to stand on its own. What emerges is not independence yet, only confidence. Confidence changes questions. Instead of asking how to follow, it asks when to lead. That subtle shift signals the next stage, where roles blur and expectations quietly realign across shared production relationships. When the supplier became the competitor. At first, nothing officially changed. Contracts renewed. Shipments continued. Labels stayed the same. From the outside, the relationship looked stable, even comfortable, built on familiarity and routine. The shift happened gradually, marked more by timing than declaration. Capabilities reached a point where waiting felt unnecessary. Once schedules were met consistently, additional work no longer felt like a stretch. The supplier knew when gaps appeared and how to fill them. Brand identity followed function. When internal projects began to resemble external ones, separation lost meaning. Names emerged not as challenges but as formalities, ways to organize work that was already happening under one roof. This was not driven by ambition alone. It was enabled by readiness. The tools were there. The standards were understood. The confidence to apply them independently had formed through repetition, not rebellion. The moment of realization came quietly. A product appeared that no longer needed comparison to justify itself. It simply existed, occupying space that once belonged to someone else. That moment did not announce competition. It confirmed it. Timing matters here. Acceptance does not arrive with the first capable product. It arrives later, after repetition dulls surprise. Competence can exist without permission, but recognition follows its own schedule, shaped by perception, patience, and the slow adjustment of expectations across markets over time as familiarity replaces novelty and comparison loses its urgency entirely for observers watching closely unfold. Buying credibility instead of inventing it. Engineering competence does not automatically change perception. For many buyers, acceptance begins with shape, proportion, and surface. Design speaks first, long before specifications are considered. The solution was not to invent a new language, but to borrow an existing one. Established design centers offered vocabulary already understood. Lines felt familiar, stances communicated purpose. Visual cues aligned with expectations built over decades of exposure. This shift operated independently of manufacturing. Styling decisions lived in studios, not factories. Their role was to frame the machine in terms people recognized, lowering resistance before deeper questions arose. Heritage functioned as a bridge. It did not guarantee approval, but it shortened the distance between curiosity and consideration. When a bike looks like it belongs, it receives attention without apology. That attention, however, is fragile. Appearance opens the door, but it cannot hold it. Once use begins, surfaces give way to substance. Stress replaces stillness. Under those conditions, design stops leading the conversation. It steps aside. This is where perception hands control back to reality. The visual argument has done its work. What follows depends on everything learned earlier, applied without assistance. Capability earned quietly now faces its first real test. Stress reveals more than intention. When conditions change, promises vanish. What remains is process, discipline, and judgment developed over time. That reality will determine whether credibility holds when attention fades and scrutiny replaces curiosity for experienced observers. Which belief broke first? The belief did not shatter in public. It thinned quietly, worn down by repetition rather than challenged outright. For years, the assumption held that certain machines were fine for light duty, but not sustained strain. They looked acceptable, standing still, yet doubt followed them whenever conditions turned harsh. Nothing dramatic disproved it at once. Instead, small moments accumulated. A bike finishing where it was not expected to. Another returning intact after conditions that usually expose weakness. Observers noticed patterns before they noticed headlines. The absence of failure began to speak louder than any claim. What changed first was not opinion, but behavior. People stopped bracing for disappointment. They watched more closely, less out of skepticism and more out of curiosity. The old stereotype still existed, but it required active maintenance. Without reinforcement, it started slipping across conversations and casual judgments among observers. Importantly, this shift did not require explanation. No one needed to argue. The evidence appeared through normal use, through ordinary exposure to stress that reveals flaws quickly. When those flaws failed to appear, silence replaced certainty. This was the first belief to bend, not because it was attacked, but because it stopped matching observation. That gap widened slowly, inviting a harder test. Looking acceptable is easy. Surviving pressure is something else entirely. Experience forced a pause. Once appearances faded, the question moved from looks to endurance, where survival mattered more than winning. When conditions turn unforgiving, theory becomes irrelevant. Long stretches of heat, vibration, and load erase excuses quickly. In those environments, finishing matters more than placement. The machines that return under their own power answer questions without commentary. Here, attention stayed on survival. Did the bike complete the task? Did it remain intact? Did it return ready for more? These outcomes required no interpretation. They were either present or absent, visible to anyone watching. No reassurance accompanied these moments. There were no claims of toughness or durability offered in advance. The machines were placed into situations that punish shortcuts. What emerged from that exposure was simply a record of completion over time, noted without ceremony or defense. Observers noted consistency. One success could be dismissed as luck. Repeated survival could not. Each additional result reduced the room for doubt, without demanding belief. The machines earned attention by remaining unremarkable under abuse across varied conditions and extended use without complaint. Endurance settled one argument while opening another. Lasting through punishment proves baseline strength, but it does not answer every question. Precision lives elsewhere, exposed under tighter margins. Endurance alone does not reveal how finely something is built. This phase forced observers to stop theorizing and start counting outcomes, an uncomfortable but necessary adjustment in perspective. With survival established, scrutiny shifted toward consistency. If you value this kind of grounded analysis and want more stories that cut through hype, subscribe now. Staying subscribed ensures you see these shifts early, before assumptions harden, narratives set, and decisions get made without the full picture context. Consistency, where small errors multiply. Precision shows itself where tolerance narrows. Small deviations matter, Repetition magnifies error. In these conditions, speed is secondary. What counts is whether the same result can be produced again and again without drift or surprise. Here, the focus remained deliberately plain. No celebration followed clean runs. No emphasis rested on peak output. Attention stayed on stability. When machines behaved the same way each time, observers took note and withheld judgment quietly and deliberately. The absence of drama was the signal. Consistency rarely announces itself. It appears through predictability, through the quiet confidence of outcomes that repeat without surprise. Each repetition reduced the need for explanation or defense over time and repeated observation. Importantly, this stage avoided context. No one revisited how the capability formed. The question was not where it came from, but whether it held under scrutiny. By separating result from origin, the test remained fair and contained. As consistency became visible, a new curiosity surfaced. The machines were not just meeting expectations, they were improving rapidly between observations. That pace raised questions unrelated to strength or precision, pointing instead toward time itself and its compression. Patterns emerging across repeated tests suggested systems at work beyond chance, inviting closer inspection without conclusions or assumptions forming prematurely. Improvement speed drew attention to the process behind it. Progress that refused to follow the old timeline. The compressed timeline puzzled observers more than the results themselves. Capability appeared sooner than precedent suggested. The explanation did not lie in sudden brilliance or exceptional talent. It rested in access to resources already built and waiting within reach, facilities designed for scale accelerate learning. Testing environments capable of simulating years of use in weeks remove delays that once defined progress. When iteration cycles shorten, refinement follows quickly without fanfare or announcement. This speed does not require admiration. It reflects conditions, not ambition. When resources exist to test, adjust, and repeat without interruption, development naturally accelerates. The process rewards persistence rather than insight. What mattered was continuity. Feedback loops stayed intact. Changes were applied immediately. Results were measured without pause. That rhythm collapses timelines quietly, producing advancement without spectacle or distraction or unnecessary delay. With capability now visible, a final barrier remained. Results can be proven publicly, yet acceptance still happens privately. Trust does not move at the same speed as development. It forms slowly, shaped by personal experience rather than observation alone. That distance continues to matter for many observers today. Demonstrations create awareness, but ownership creates belief. Time spent maintaining, repairing, and relying on a machine weighs more than headlines or results. Until experience replaces speculation, hesitation survives. Progress may be measurable, but confidence remains earned individually, one ordinary ride, decision, and outcome at a time through repetition, exposure, patience, and accountability. That pause between proof and belief remains the final distance these machines must quietly cross alone. Proven capability sets the stage, but trust belongs elsewhere. Why hesitation still exists? Hesitation does not come from ignorance. It comes from memory. Experienced buyers carry long timelines in their heads, filled with lessons learned the hard way. When something new appears quickly, caution activates before curiosity. That response is not fear. It is self-preservation, shaped by repetition. Trust is personal and slow. It forms through ownership, not observation. Watching a machine perform is different from living with it. Buyers who have spent decades maintaining their own equipment know how small problems grow expensive over time. That knowledge lingers quietly whenever unfamiliar names appear on familiar machines. Skepticism here is measured, not hostile. It does not reject outright. It waits. It asks questions without demanding answers immediately. Most hesitation comes from uncertainty around what happens after the first year, not during the first impression. Confidence alone does not close that gap. Psychology fills spaces engineering cannot. A machine can prove itself publicly, yet remain untested privately. Until someone depends on it during an ordinary week, doubts remain intact. That is not unfair. It matches how trust has always worked in mechanical ownership. What holds buyers back is not disbelief, but incomplete reassurance built over time. Belief requires structure behind confidence, not slogans or demonstrations. Without visible support, hesitation stays rational. Confidence may open interest briefly, but consistent support ultimately decides commitment when ownership replaces observation, and experience becomes personal over repeated miles, seasons, repairs, delays, expectations, conversations, outcomes, and lived responsibility. When support stops being an excuse, ownership lives in details. Parts availability, service access, and turnaround time define daily reality more than specifications ever will. For years, uncertainty in these areas justified hesitation. That justification is eroding quietly as conditions change. Observable shifts matter more than promises. Distribution centers expanded, dealer networks widened, inventory practices adjusted. These are not opinions. They are operational facts visible through wait times and service schedules rather than marketing statements. Support becomes credible when problems resolve quickly. When parts arrive without delay, anxiety fades naturally. When service knowledge exists locally, reliance grows. These changes do not require enthusiasm. They require consistency. Practical considerations dominate here. Routine maintenance must happen without special effort or surprise. Repairs need to proceed without extended downtime or uncertainty. Ownership has to feel normal, not exceptional, week after week. These questions answer themselves through repeated experience, not promises. As support strengthens, it stops functioning as an excuse and fades into the background. With that barrier removed, decisions begin moving forward naturally. Yet another factor waits behind it, unavoidable and impersonal. Once support stabilizes across regions, cost comparisons gain weight, clarity, and urgency in every buying decision for experienced buyers, evaluating long-term ownership realities carefully today alone. Numbers that legacy brands can't rearrange. Price enters the conversation late for a reason. It matters most after other concerns fade. When support and capability align, numbers become harder to ignore. This is where structural differences appear without argument. Comparisons do not need exaggeration. When similar equipment arrives bundled rather than optional, the contrast becomes visible. When pricing gaps persist without explanation, pressure builds quietly. These realities speak without judgment. Legacy brands operate within established frameworks. Their costs are fixed by history, scale, and expectation. Adjusting quickly is difficult when systems evolved over decades. Matching new pricing structures requires changes that ripple through entire organizations. This does not imply failure or decline. It reveals constraint. The math resists easy solutions because it reflects accumulated decisions rather than current intent. Responding requires time, not reaction. Market pressure rarely announces itself. It builds quietly through countless small choices repeated by individuals over time. Each decision seems harmless alone, but together they bend systems. As buying habits shift, supply chains tighten, margins thin, and expectations drift. Structures begin to strain, not from shocks, but from persistence. No memo grants approval, no warning light flashes. Structural pressure reshapes the landscape without permission, altering incentives, priorities, and outcomes long before leaders admit change is underway across markets worldwide today. What this quietly resets. The reset underway is subtle. It does not replace one order with another overnight. It alters assumptions gradually, forcing reevaluation without demanding allegiance. The change lives in conversations rather than headlines. What has shifted is the baseline. Expectations around capability, support, and cost no longer align with old categories. Buyers compare differently. Manufacturers respond cautiously. The process remains unfinished. This moment does not signal an ending. It signals adjustment. Established players retain strengths. New entrants carry momentum. Both adapt under shared pressure. Awareness matters more than prediction. Understanding the forces at work clarifies choices without prescribing them. The landscape keeps moving, shaped by countless decisions made quietly over time. Some shifts happen through boardrooms, others through garages, dealerships, and daily riding habits. None announce themselves loudly. They accumulate, then suddenly feel obvious. What matters now is recognizing that the ground beneath familiar markers has shifted. Old reference points no longer line up the same way. That awareness changes how everything ahead is judged, compared, valued, and questioned, even when no single moment feels decisive. Experience, patience, and observation guide decisions moving forward. If you've been riding long enough, you know markets don't change overnight. The ground shifts first. That's what we walked through today. If this breakdown helped you see what's really going on, hit like so more riders find it. Subscribe if you want. Honest biker analysis without the hype, and drop a comment with your experience. What bike made you stop and say, something's different now?